Hey everyone, I'm Alex Montero with Strongtown Chicago, and this is our Speaker Series podcast where we highlight urbanist voices from the city. Today's guest is a professor at the University of Chicago of Urban Design. She also runs the Urbanism Lab at University of Chicago, and she recently wrote a book called What Cities Say that talks about how different concepts of urban design have changed and interacted with each other over the course of history and what they mean for what a city's values are. So with that, I'd like to welcome Professor Emily Talen. Thank you for being with us.
Thank you so much for having me, and thanks for the book plug. I appreciate it.
Yeah, of course. So I wanted to start with the book, actually, and ask, I loved reading it. I thought it was a very cool analysis that combined a lot of concepts of what makes for good design, historical elements, those kinds of things. What inspired you to write this book in the first place, and who did you write it for?
Good questions. I've been working on this book for a really long time, probably my whole career, because this is the thing that interests me the most, is how to look at the city and what do we say about it other than facts and data, and what are the meanings of something like as mundane as a sidewalk, buildings of different height, different kinds of public spaces. What do those mean to us, and how do we interpret them? So this was really, and a lot of people have written about this. Almost any good urbanist book will include meaning and interpretation about different kinds of urban forms and patterns. So what this project was about was really consolidating all those different meanings and interpretations in one succinct area, one concise kind of volume. I'd been relying for a long time on the books by Spiro Kostof, who was kind of my hero. I absolutely love his two books, The City Shaped and The Urban Pattern, which are wonderful, wonderful books, but it's really dense writing. Like, to get to a particular point, you have to weave through a lot of different things. So this was an attempt to kind of consolidate all the interpretations and meanings that have been written about that I could find from any part of the globe, any time period, and just kind of put them all together in one place. So what are all the things we can say about the grid? You know, it was really hard to figure out how to organize this book because it's so much material. But in the end, after spinning around and around on it, I settled on 35 different forms and have interpretations for each of those.
And the book does read a lot of times like sort of urbanist theory's greatest hits. You mentioned Jane Jacobs a lot of times, Mumford, a lot of other big thinkers and writers behind this.
Yes.
How did you decide what to bring in from each of those voices, considering that in a lot of cases, these folks have written volumes and volumes of work over their careers and sometimes changed their views over their careers? How did you figure out what was relevant from the ideas that had put out there to the different forms that you were exploring?
Well, I mean, there is a certain attitude to this book. You know, like I'm not agnostic about things.
Right.
Like,
it's not values neutral.
Oh, right. But I do try to present opposing sides. So something like a tower in a park, right?
Right.
Bad, but people have different opinions about it, and I try to present those. But in reading through all the literature, I really just tried to pull out whatever was about meaning and value and interpretation and what people have written about linking, you know, what it means for society, what it means for culture, what it means for how we are as a people, what it says about our values, linking all of that to very specific physical things. That's the trick, you know, really thinking about, you know, it's not just a sidewalk, it's not just a grid, it's not just a piece of lawn, you know, all of these things have embedded meanings, and that's what I tried to draw out.
Right. And I appreciate that it's a very visual book as well. Obviously, the interpretation and the discussion of these ideas and how they fit together is very key. But it helps that because this is so much about the built form, sometimes it's hard to imagine, well, what do these differences in grid look like? You can use all the adjectives in the world, but unless you see that plan or you see a neighborhood from an angle and see the differences in altitude, it's hard to actually understand as a reader. Was that a bit of a challenge as you were writing it to think through, what image represents this issue best? Or did you start in some cases with some of the pictures and then figure out how to tell the story around it?
Yeah, it was always referencing specific places.
Right.
I mean, that was actually kind of the easy part, because when these meanings and values and interpretations are discussed, and I guess what I picked out from the literature was discussion around a very specific element or place.
Chicago features pretty prominently in this book as some examples of, obviously, the grid, different eras of urban design, of examples of things being built bottom up versus more top down and more monumentalist structure. You've spent a big portion of your career as well in the city. Do you think that your experience of teaching and living in Chicago informed at all the way you approach this book and some of the topics in it?
Yeah, I mean, there's a reason Chicago is the most studied city in the world, or seems to be. It's got everything here. And this is why I absolutely love living and working in the city and using the city as my, toolbox from which to have all these examples. Yeah, so Chicago is very important.
One of the things that you explore in the book, you mentioned how sometimes you try to present both sides of the conversation and, in defense of monumentalism and brutalism versus some of the critiques of it. But one of the things that you point out too sometimes is that the proponents of some of these elements of design, say Baroque design or especially modernism, with modernism specifically, you point out that this was the way to build cities for the middle part of the 20th century across a wide variety of different states and countries and economic systems, right? In Western countries like the United States and Western Europe, in what was then the Soviet Union and socialist top-down planned economies, and in post-colonial countries that were trying to assert an identity that was separate from their previous colonizers. And somehow they all centered on modernist design and a lot of towers and planned and more spaces between everything as something they went to, even though they got there for very different reasons. Are there other examples of that stuck out to you as you were doing this research, of people arriving to similar conclusions, but for pretty different reasons?
Yeah, I mean, you look at something like the grid, right? And this is what makes this kind of project pretty complicated. Because one, as you say, one kind of element or form or pattern can have multiple interpretations and reasons for why it became, so. So you have the socialist monumentalism, and you have authoritarianism, which is also sort of socialist, different political structures arriving at the same kind of urban form. But the grid really stands out as something that is for capitalist accumulation in some eras, for egalitarianism and really ensuring everybody has the same size parcel, for ease of pedestrian movement. And then there's this whole very fascinating religious symbolism attached to the grid. So it goes all the way from this sort of mystical religious symbolism to really hardcore capitalist land speculation facilitations. And there's other things besides the grid that are functioning in that way.
Right. And especially that tension a lot of times between what is determined top down, or what is the hard infrastructure that is set first, and what develops naturally around it. One of the things early in the book, because you start exploring forms that are pretty historical, right? Everything from ancient Greek cities and how they were laid out to medieval cities and how they developed. And one of the points, and I had never really thought about this, is part of the reason why medieval cities were so compact is because stone walls are really hard and expensive to build. And so once you've built one, there's this pressure to keep everything inside of it so that you don't need to build another fortification.
Right.
And that being something that even in an era where people were just building things out of wood, there was pressure to build up. I'm curious, how do you see the role of those kinds of, the difference between what gets built by some powerful authority, be it a government or a big company or something, to set the guides of what's possible or what's feasible, versus the things that smaller contributors build themselves?
Well, there's a constant interplay there. And, sometimes it works well together. Like sometimes we need a benevolent dictator to, lay out the main bones of a development and then let the smaller incremental development of the city just kind of happen. And it's facilitated by that stronger effort, you know. Sometimes it doesn't play as well. Of course, urban renewal is a classic example there of just kind of wiping out whole districts in the name of efficiency, which turned out to not be efficient at all. So yeah, there's a lot of complex interplay between those two things. And it really brings up the point that some things in the city are a result of very utilitarian kind of efficiency-based, seemingly efficient reasonings behind a pattern or form, all the way to things that are frivolous, and just like an aesthetic gesture. So those things kind of intersect in interesting ways as well.
Mm-hmm. In Chicago, are there things you think that were large central investments that made development of the rest of the city possible that maybe we don't value as much or aren't as aware of as we should be? Everything from hard infrastructure to where the sewer pipes were laid out, but also big investments like where the major manufacturers and the mills in those places decided to set up.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, we have those big gestures for sure. And, the kinds of things that Burnham laid out, some of the boulevards and protecting the lakefront, all very important. The effort to kind of keep things, I think of Washington, D.C. a lot of symbolism there with trying to keep buildings at a particular height so that what we want to come out and for people to recognize is our big civic institutions like the Capitol, the White House, So keep the commercial life of the city and the residential the private life of the city kind of flatter and down so that civic life goes up. But of course, that was all blown to hell by the rise of the commercial city.
Right, and of the skyscraper. In fact, if you think of a city where commerce literally towers over everything else, Chicago's probably one of the main historical examples that comes to mind.
Totally, yep.
Mm-hmm.
I don't think Burnham would have liked that very much.
Right. And that's something I'm interested in as well. I think there's a lot of tendency among people who are nerds about cities and urban design between looking at something that's a master plan, beautiful, elegant, looks great in a book, Burnham's Plan of Chicago being a famous example, and then looking at how things actually function due to practical reality or economic necessity, right? And I think potentially Chicago's an example of those two things conflicting with each other over a lot of different eras of time, right? From the very beginning of the city with the railroad boom and the beginning of the stockyards and those kinds of things, to some of the large changes of raising the streets and reversing the flow of the river, to the 50s and 60s urban renewal efforts and the eds and meds, which you talk about in the book as well. Do you think that there's a particular dynamic that is this generation's version of either urban renewal or building out the grid or those kinds of things that's going to define what the city looks like over the next few decades?
Going on right now?
Yeah.
Well, there's still big money at play, still big gestures happening, but I see, I don't know, there's a certain hesitancy to do things that big, bold gestures where we wish the city, governance would actually do them. Like in particular, the vacant land in the city, the CHA holding all this vacant land. I just went on a tour of Southside public housing, and it was basically a tour of vacant land. And so you're just thinking, where's the really strong, Mayor Daley, for all the horrible things he did stuff, and so it's really delicate though, because you have to find the balance. You don't want these big players who can go in there and do stuff and get stuff done. What if they do bad things like urban renewal kinds of things? So that's a huge challenge. What I'm really energized about is the youth, the younger generation after me for sure, being really very involved in a lot of these urban decisions and getting out there, like the urban environmentalists and strong towns and all CNU, all the different groups out there, that is really such a hopeful thing that you will start to exert your opinion in a way that you temper these big gestures. Now, we just need the big gestures to happen, and then you can temper them. Like the redevelopment of the 78, Lincoln Yards, sort of these big projects. They just seem sort of stalled. The public input part, it seems really lame, like they're not really listening to people. So the more you can energize and make sure that cities are treated the way they should be, I think that'll be really hopeful.
Mm-hmm. One of the things that we're seeing right now, the city's in the middle of figuring out basically how they're going to bridge a budget gap, right? And so all kinds of discussions of how do cities not just build things, but collect revenue to build things and to fund things and social services and schools and everything else that's necessary for a city to operate. And I think an interesting part of that conversation that's maybe not explored as much, but that I feel you have a lot to say about is the role of density and the role of how many households live in the neighborhood to support the underlying infrastructure as playing a role in that. A lot of times it's framed as a conversation of just should we raise property taxes or not, or increase the parking fees or any of these other things, without necessarily asking the question of, well, maybe we have overbuilt infrastructure and are there more people who could be taking advantage of that, or more people who could be paying into the system to keep it up, and what does that look like? I know you have a couple of images you shared of different kind of urban forms and how density sometimes varies wildly in ways that aren't totally intuitive. So if you want, we can take a look at that.
I was thinking more of showing some examples of how you might interpret different levels of density.
Right.
And just make sure that, so that you asked before what was the audience for my book, and it's really for absolutely anyone who's interested in being part of the conversation about what is the future city we're going for here. And I feel like the tool one needs to be in that conversation is to really be able to articulate what something like this means, the image you're looking at here. So this is two different versions of a very low density area. This is Scottsdale. Who knew we had a Scottsdale in Chicago? 17 people per acre. And then, of course, iconic Riverside, Illinois, the Frederick Law Olmsted designed subdivision from, a century earlier, 1869. Anyway, what do we see here when we look at this? First of all, it's really important to make sure everybody understands, and I tried to make this point in the book, that there's a huge variation in when we're talking about suburb. A suburb can be so many different things. And one of the variables that makes one suburb different than another is the degree to which it has a node around which it's organized. Does it have a center to it? Does it have a walkable urban center, or at least suburban center? So in the case of Riverside, of course, you have that node. There's a transit station there. It has a little commercial area. So that's all good. The, Scottsdale example is just all about total car dependency, not walkable. It's all about driving everywhere. Usually there is no node. So we'll give credit to Riverside. It's a beautiful place. But the point here is that these are areas where one's individual conception of life is at the forefront. You are realizing your life singularly in your house, which is one way of living, of course. One is free to drive here and there to put together kind of the pieces of your daily life existence, put that together yourself rather than in a collective kind of way. Communal principles are just not very strong here. It's really giving a message of one house on one lot. I'm going to have my own individual reality. And by the way, you might know already that this was very much promoted in the 20th century by government leaders, the single family house and a lot, specifically to be an anti-socialism way of building America. Because if you had a single family home on an individual lot, you therefore were countering the socialist Bolshevik tendencies, as Herbert Hoover put it.
The idea being that people are more likely to broadly support property ownership when they own some property. And feel like it's something that they have.
It's their own piece of the world. And we want to nurture that individualism.
Right.
It's good for property development. It's good for making a lot of people money. So, of course, the other thing going on here is you have segregated uses. And there's a lot of meaning in that, in when you're segregating uses, because you're really cutting down on the ability of a city to have interconnection between what various people from various walks of life are doing. If you separate it all out, you don't have that interconnection. Of course, the automobile is very much being prioritized here. And, you don't have, I'll just show another example. This is just to not pick on Riverside so much. So the other thing we can talk about here is the nature aesthetic here. The idea that we are now living in nature. Our houses are closer to the ground than an apartment building would be, and we're literally more connected to the ground in that way. The curvilinearity of the streets is some kind of gesture toward organic ways of thinking. You're being more organic by being curvilinear. It's more like nature. Housing needs to be set back to sort of carry that illusion of having, more green. Of course, one of the many ironies here is that this is not green at all. This is not a sustainable way of building, of human settlement. It's actually bad for nature, as you know.
Well, I had a conversation with someone about parks, too, with that same principle that happens with subdivisions, where parks a lot of times evoke nature or people's idea of nature, but everything in a public city park was put there by someone. It's not that they took a portion of the forest and cordoned it off and kept it the same way forever. The trees, the ponds, all of that was landscaped and put in place, and that's especially true in something like a subdivision.
Right. You're actually moving the earth around, and, all these expansive lawns are just the opposite of what natural habitat needs often. And here's another irony. It's just full of ironies. This idea that this is getting closer to country living. Country life was all about toil and really difficult. So this sort of illusion that you're living like your little farm out in the woods kind of thing, or farm on the land is just ironic. And the land of leisure, that's really what is I'm not being very nice to suburban living, am I?
I'm what I would call a recovering suburban kid. I grew out in the burbs, and then had a chance to move into the city, and here as an adult, and so I understand some of the same frustrations because I had those same very real ones, right? And I think there's a narrative a lot of times too. There's the physical environment, but something you talk about in the book as well is how these design decisions reinforce other social ideas, things like domesticity, right? How when you have a house to take care of, it's much easier to normalize the idea of one partner stays at home, takes care of the children, is in that safe domain. The other one goes to work, commutes in, and you sort of shelter the family from the rest of the world.
Oh, sure. It's totally 1950s.
Right.
And which is just also ironic because we no longer have two parents and kids in the household with one, the dad working kind of thing.
Yeah. There's a lot of research and literature right now too on the suburbanization of poverty, as they call it, where in the first wave, most of the people who went out to the suburbs were people who were at least middle class and escaping cities. But over time, as some of those suburban environments have decayed or become less desirable, fallen out of fashion, infrastructure has suffered, many people who previously would settle in cities because of job opportunities are settling in suburbs because essentially it's at bargain prices because a lot of the luster has worn off. How do you see that changing how some of these places are perceived going forward? Maybe the image we have of the American suburb changes versus what the 50s ideal was.
Well, I think I hope there's more realism. You know what? I got to tell you, though, I'm worried about this new administration. that is going to be a boon for sprawl. They are about highways. They are not about transit. They're about, getting rid of regulations wherever they can. I mean, a lot of things are under local control, and they're not going to be able to just swoop in and change zoning or something like that. But the funding of the highways is a big deal. And being even more friendly in terms of tax credits and things like that to enable sprawl, to enable sprawl development worries me greatly. So...
Well, and even in housing itself, when it's built, a lot of that financing is, if not directly controlled by the government, at least backed by the government, things like FHA loans and renovation loans and those kinds of things. So what it becomes feasible for somebody to buy a lot of times depends on what the federal government sets the standards at.
And we even had a little fantasy about doing away with the single-family home mortgage deduction. That's not happening now. So I think we've really taken a step back. And the other thing is, it's, the social homogeneity. You mentioned that poorer people moving into the suburbs, but the suburbs do tend to be a place not built for diversity, not built for social diversity, not built for land use diversity. So that doesn't bode very well for what our aspirations are about human settlement. We want places to be diverse, right?
Yeah. A term that Strong Towns gets used pretty frequently is like price tagged neighborhoods, where because all of the houses are roughly the same size in a particular subdivision and on the same lots and cost about the same, you have people of the same socioeconomic background move in. In a lot of suburbs in my hometown, there's a similar dynamic where there were subdivisions that all of the kids at school considered rich and subdivisions that they considered poor or working class. And you knew where those lines were based on how the lot size shrank when you crossed a certain street. So it's the fact that all of the housing is built in giant parcels at once, which is different from different cities going up at different points on a block, I think encourages that kind of price tagging in ways that doesn't happen as much in other more traditional forms, right?
Sure, absolutely. And it's, it's production building, right? It's about making the built environment as singular as possible as a way of, increasing your profits. So...
We've been beating up on the suburban development pattern for a little bit, which I could do for hours, but I know you have a couple of examples of alternatives to that and how density is kind of different on those sometimes, how we read those.
Let's go to the next one. Let's just talk about something more dense. This is Hilliard Towers, just south of the Loop. We're doing better here with density, with 53 people per acre, but this is kind of the classic towers in a park. I think it's funny or ironic, the attempt to be more natural by having curvilinearity in the buildings, trying to have these like natural shapes, I suppose, organic shapes. That's one thing. This attempt to do away with streets and kind of have a super block kind of arrangement, that's interesting because it's, this kind of development still happens all the time. And it's violating the traditional notion of having the street be the main focus of settlement. So that there's public life that happens in the street, there's aligned frontages to, have this sense of enclosure, this outdoor room. And instead, we'll just have nature. So the problem with that is that people don't naturally come together and intersect in just a bunch of green space. They intersect and there's social connection going on when it's taking place in a street where you have sidewalks and you have commerce and you have a reason for going on the street because you're participating in exchange in all kinds of ways. Green space is passive. And so you have to make a very concerted effort to have that social interaction.
Right. There's a term that's been popularized recently, which has been around for a while, but it's only recently, I think, that you start seeing even very young people talk about it, is third places, right? The idea that your first and second place is where you live and where you work, and your third place is where you go to do other things, usually some form of social interaction, to eat, to meet people, to learn different things. And traditionally, that's been things, everything from bars to bowling alleys to social clubs, those kinds of things. In a lot of sort of these mass developments of towers in the park, as you mentioned, there's not a publicly accessible place for people to congregate and make those kind of organic connections. Sometimes some of these buildings have inside them a rec room or something like that, but it's very clearly just for whoever lives in the tower and not for anyone else in the neighborhood who may be passing by.
Yeah, good point. The public space is just defined completely differently in this kind of arrangement.
Mm-hmm.
So this is doing a little better with density, but just talking about our goals of increasing density. Mm-hmm. Let's go to the next slide, because this is really our sweet spot.
Good old Rogers Park.
Good old Rogers Park. But, it's true. There's a diversity of building types, which translates to a diversity of income levels and possibly racial diversity as well. You have some kind of sense of that public space happening on the street. You have mixed uses happening on the commercial areas there, which is not trivial at all. It's super important. And because you have those networks of consumers and producers and all kinds of forms of exchange taking place. So it's sort of a Jane Jacobs message here, but of course she was not very tolerant of 91 people per acre. She wanted a whole lot more than that. But hey, in Chicago, I'll take it. If you look at the levels of diversity in Chicago, it is exactly places like Rogers Park that are socially diverse, although we're losing that because they're getting kind of loved to death, and we don't have enough of this diversity of housing types. And so that's kind of a problem.
Right. And to the point specifically on density, to put a finer point on it, the first couple examples we saw of suburban sprawl, maybe with some node, but largely single family homes, about 17 people per acre. Mm-hmm. Towers in the park kind of set up about 50 people per acre, and this is at 90. So we're at twice what big modernist towers would accomplish, even if they look much bigger, look much higher capacity, and somewhere about 4 or 5 times more than ordinary subdivision, right?
Right.
How is it that it's that much more density when most people walking through this neighborhood would say it seems pretty quiet, it seems pretty residential? The 2 and 3 flats don't really scream out a lot of people live here.
Yeah, I don't know why that is, because I have the data.
Sure.
And it's there. There's a lot of smaller units embedded in here. So this is gentle density. This is density that is not at all scary density. And it's a very desirable kind of density for all kinds of reasons. You have eyes on the street. You have a good sense of the social life of the space, although there are no people in this picture. But yeah, it just makes a huge difference.
And I wanted to ask you about the housing types that we see on here. So here we see some combinations of different kinds of small compact apartment buildings, right? Famously in Chicago, there's the 2 flat or 3 flat is one of the most ubiquitous forms, which is because our lots are so narrow, usually only 25 feet wide, apartments literally stacked on top of each other. And then maybe something that's on a double lot that has a few more units or has a courtyard kind of shape. Tell me a little bit about how, from your studies, you've seen these neighborhoods came together, where originally there was maybe rougher buildings, wood, and over time those got replaced. What does that process look like? What did it used to look like?
Well, it was incremental development. It was lot by lot. It wasn't all laid out by one developer who was also building all the housing. It would have been more diverse than that. The zoning rules would have allowed the single family and duplexes and triplexes and fourplexes, and there's some sixplexes in there. A lot of this building is pre-zoning. And of course, now building in this way is probably illegal in a lot of parts of Chicago, which is very unfortunate. So yeah, just more incremental. This is why small scale developers, small scale builders. And this is what I hope is the younger generation really going to activate more so now, is getting involved in development in a small scale way. Because right now, like when we see all this vacant land around transit stops, there's TOD happening, transit-oriented development, but building there those kinds of projects takes multi-millions, capital stacks that just are so complicated, and all these different financial arrangements that just blow your mind, and they take years to pull off. So, and they tend to be pretty large format, and people don't like them that much.
And you get into a situation, too, where if the particular entity that's working on that project, you mentioned earlier the 78 in Lincoln Yards, if they run into problems with their lenders or their investors or anything else, you have that entire project potentially getting delayed for a decade.
Right.
So
right.
it's very all
Good
or
point.
nothing.
Yeah, so they lack resilience. And if we could just get back to this way of building, small scale, incremental, lot by lot, small scale developers doing fourplexes, wouldn't that be heaven? Wouldn't that be a great city?
I know that I'm on board for that vision, and a lot of the kinds of folks who watch Strong Towns content and are part of local conversations are as well. What would you say to people who have the reaction? Because I've heard this too sometimes, where they say, you know, these neighborhoods are nice, they're quaint, it's a cool kind of fabric, that's nice. But this is how we built cities 100 years ago. Technology has changed. We have cars now. Telecommuting is more prevalent, whatever. Things have changed, and this is just not a realistic way to build cities anymore. You're not going to have families save up money and then build a 2-flat, and so we should move on to other forms, be that subdivisions or larger tower projects or those kinds of things. Do you think there's some legitimacy to that argument, or is this still a viable model? It's just there have to be some policy tweaks to make it possible again.
I reject that argument because one thing that hasn't changed and will never change is the human body. We have a certain proportion and the need to walk or bike or wheel. That doesn't change. That doesn't change at all. You know, so when people say, oh, we need newfangled ways of building things, I guess I don't have a whole lot of tolerance for it. Also because that way of thinking has gotten us into trouble a lot over the years. This sort of quest for technology is going to save us, you know, and we're going to just kind of come up with magic bullets to have this sort of unfettered design approach to building cities. Those kinds of experiments are happening all the time, and they, you know, those are not saving us. What is really tragic is we don't have enough of this kind of traditional urban fabric. I don't care if it's 100 years old. It works. You know, it just, the empirical reality is there. It's the most socially diverse fabric we have without massive government intervention. So we have other areas that are mixed income in high rises and things, but there's huge subsidies going on. This is unsubsidized NOAAs, as they're called, naturally occurring affordable housing.
Right.
And that's really important, especially as government starts, you know, getting out of the business of helping with affordability, at least at the federal level, for sure.
One dynamic I know exists in Chicago and in other places that have this style of housing is multi-generational housing within a building, right? The stereotype being that the grandparents live on the ground floor and then the family with the young kids lives on the top unit. And maybe if there's a third unit, they rent it out. And that gives the benefits of community, the benefits of having family close, help is a knock away and so on. But everyone has their own space in a way that's a little bit different if, you know, the nightmare a lot of people have in their heads of their in-laws having to move into a single family house with them, right? And particularly in a lot of immigrant communities and Hispanic communities in different parts of the city, that's a pretty standard setup. Do you see other kinds of social benefits that way, whether it's making, you know, family bonds stronger or other kinds of things that this kind of development pattern in housing enables, aside from just increasing density and making housing more affordable potentially?
Yeah, absolutely. And that's a really important point, too, because if you think about the suburban sprawl image with all the housing of the same kind, built for homogeneity, there's no sense of the future there. You know, where are the kids supposed to go? Where, as you age and need you need to downscale, where are you supposed to go? Like, there's no contemplation of that kind of changing dynamic. So the fact that these kinds of places do have that mix of unit types is so much more hopeful. And says that, we're going to allow people as they change in their life circumstances to not necessarily have to leave the neighborhood. That's pretty important.
You mentioned that Rogers Park is a great example of this, and there are others in Chicago, but that we could use a lot more of these, right? For different people who want to live in these kinds of neighborhoods and could benefit from those kinds of arrangements. Given where the city is now, what do you think are some opportunities to begin doing that, to encourage these kinds of neighborhoods to build up or spring up in areas where they haven't, and potentially there's opportunity through vacant lots or decent connection to transit or some other device there? There's not a whole lot of completely greenfield space left in the city anymore, but there are plenty of places where there's a lot of open lots within a neighborhood that would be pretty well connected otherwise.
It's really pretty shocking, the level of density around transit areas in Chicago outside of the loop. Very low density, a lot of single family housing, single family zoning, of course, but also just single family housing fabric in transit areas. And that has got to change. I just think that those are areas that you absolutely need to densify and create these kinds of neighborhoods with missing middle infill. And there's a lot of vacant land too. I mean, in transit areas. So that needs to be, development in those areas needs to be incentivized in a big way. I often see the city doing things like putting in community gardens in vacant land. And I wonder about that, because next to transit, I don't know that we should be having community gardens next to transit. I'll probably get in trouble for saying that, but I think those are the places where we need to start creating these incrementally developed, missing gentle density kinds of neighborhoods, maybe even higher density, I don't know, but it's the gentle density that's not fought against nearly as much.
And do you see this playing a role too in commercial health of neighborhoods? There's a lot of parts in the city where between 1950 and now, the population is literally 20% of what it used to be. Englewood is a good example of that, actually. And so there was a critical mass of people to support a lot of local business that just isn't there anymore, which is why in a lot of cases you see so many vacant storefronts. Does this kind of thickening up process potentially mean something positive for those businesses that are hanging on, or even potentially new entrepreneurs that could do business there if there was a critical mass of people? How should people think about that?
Well, I think people should think in terms of developing around nodes like transit stations. And right now, I think there's a lot of development just kind of happens here and there without thinking about the context of where that density is happening. So you might get a high rise going up. It's not near transit. It's not even near a public space. And that's, so if we can think in terms of getting more population together in a node, and then, that just has all kinds of benefits. And the other thing is, so there's enabling and incentivizing development where we want it to happen, but there's also protecting and, stabilizing neighborhoods that are like Rogers Park, thinking of the Logan Squares of the world and Lincoln Square and North Center. And on the South Side too, those areas need to be, the diversity that they have, the missing middle neighborhoods that we have need to be stabilized. And what's happening now in the city is there have been some recent ordinances to stop the deconversions, stop the tear downs of the multifamily unit to put up luxury single family homes. That's great, but that's happening in very constrained areas. And so what's going to happen is pressure on the areas that are not protected in that way. Those outlying areas, peripheral areas, are going to have tremendous pressure and deconvert all over the place. So I'm worried about that. So we need a citywide protection of stabilizing missing middle. And by protection, I mean not freeze it in place, but not allow development to get rid of housing units.
Right. And even those protection ordinances only go in one direction, right? They may prevent a 3-flat from being turned into a single-family home, but they don't make it easy to convert a bungalow to do a second level addition and turn it into a 2-flat. That's still verboten in a lot of neighborhoods and according to city code.
Okay.
Do you think there's a role for potentially allowing the opposite of in neighborhoods to thicken up, and especially near transit, if a homeowner says, hey, I'd like to turn this into a multi-unit, I have the money I can put behind it, or I can get the relevant financing or whatever, to allow those people to do that by right?
Yeah, that's a really, really tricky one, because pretty soon we're tearing down all kinds of nice historic buildings, and the most sustainable building is one that's already existing, right? And so you've got that green building kind of factor there, that you don't want to get rid of viable housing units. So I struggle with that quite a bit because, and I'm teaching a housing class right now, we debate this. You know, I have some in the class who say, if there's a duplex that can come down and we put up 10 units, absolutely switch that out, you know? And then I'm thinking, well, what about, it's not that easy, because yes, we want more units, but loss of that historic building texture, that character of the neighborhood, that's a major loss. And pretty soon we've got a whole bunch of corporate looking, stripped down, boxy architecture that looks terrible and ruins a neighborhood. So I would say a lot more effort and focus on where that development is happening. If a developer wants to come in and put up a 10-unit building, are you sure there isn't another property nearby that we could try to get them to go there that doesn't involve tearing down a historic property? Are there some things we can do in that way? Can we maintain the facade somehow and add the units? But I don't know. So I struggle with that a lot. Tricky question.
Sure. Yep. Tricky issue. One last thing I wanted to ask is, first, are there any projects, any things that you're working on that you're excited about and that you would like to plug for people to know? And two, what would you recommend to people who are interested, passionate about these topics, looking for ways to get involved and help nudge things in a positive direction? What's a good way for them to get involved or learn more so that they can make a difference in the neighborhoods where they live?
Yeah, I think, the project I'm very excited about right now is turning historic Sanborn maps, which are maps from the 1920s and earlier of building footprints in Chicago, and I'm creating 3D models out of those. So I'm excited about that project. So that's making the historic city sort of come to life.
Right.
And then it's in terms of getting involved, boy, there's never been a better time. I mean, I've been here for, a couple of decades, and I've never seen such energy with all these different groups like Strong Towns and urban environmentalists and Bike Chicago. And, these groups are actually coming together and doing stuff. And you have a video pod and, this is really great. This is I haven't seen the consolidation of energy. So I would say get in touch with CNU Illinois as a starting point, or the urban environmentalists or Strong Towns. And boy, they'll plug you right in. Yep.
Always looking for volunteers for sure. So thank you for giving us and some of the friendly orgs a shout out. Okay. Well, thank you so much for sitting with us, Emily, to talk about your book, to talk about some of these development patterns in Chicago. Appreciate you taking the time today.
All right. Thank you for having me.